Hello, I'm Jeff Brown for Knowledge at Wharton. Today we're with Mauro Guillen, a professor of international management for Wharton, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
We want to talk about the state of the economy, the state of the world for 2013. And I'd like to talk about the emerging markets. We often think that this is where the future is, this is where the great growth potential is. At the same time, if you're an investor, you see a lot of volatility, and you know that there are a lot of ups and downs in these countries. What is the state of the emerging markets today?
Well, it's not as good as we would like it to be here in the United States or in Europe or in Japan, in the parts of the world that are not growing that much. And let me explain. I think most people would like the emerging economies right now to become the locomotives of the global economy, but in recent months, over the last year or so, emerging economies have also begun to slow down a little bit. They're still growing. China is growing at 6-7%. India is growing maybe 5%. But Brazil is barely growing. It's growing at less than 1%. This slowdown in the emerging economies actually comes at a bad point in time because we would like them to be a little bit more dynamic than what they are right now.
And is this a result of what's happened in the rest of the world spilling over to them, or do they have their own factors that are causing this?
Well, the answer is yes to both. The emerging economies, of course, export their manufactured products and some of their energy or other commodities to Europe or to the United States. So if growth here or in Europe is not as strong, then of course these economies suffer. But then secondly, they also have problems of their own. Brazil has encountered a number of bottlenecks in its economic development, in its growth over the last 3 or 4 years. Interest rates were too high because they were trying to keep inflation down, but that meant that then local businesses didn't have enough credit at an appropriate price to invest and to create jobs and to grow. India also is famous for many bottlenecks in infrastructure, in the legal system, and so on. One emerging economy after another, what we see is that both because of domestic reasons and global reasons, international reasons, they're starting to grow less rapidly than they used to.
And China, which was such a powerhouse there for a while, but what is going on in China? It seems to be slowing down.
Well, in China, we've had a leadership transition that is still going on in terms of filling in the various positions in the government. So there's some uncertainty regarding that. Then, of course, we have the problem with their exports to Europe in particular right now, and a little bit also to the United States, even though the U.S. economy is growing faster than European economies, which are not growing at all, except for Germany and a couple of others. And then thirdly, of course, China has the problem of transformation right now. It is an economy that has been investing a lot in infrastructure. It has been growing in terms of exports, but it is an economy that now needs to switch to the creation and the growth of a domestic consumption market. So again, these transformations, these transition phases are difficult. And I think China is now essentially wrestling with those issues.
Now, how does this affect the developed countries? Does this make them more competitive, or is this hurting them? Why should we care other than they're our fellow citizens of the world?
Well, the emerging economies are a very important part of the global economy. They're nearly half of global output, and also 40%, at least 40% of the global market for consumer goods. So if things don't go well in the emerging economies, that affects everyone, not just them. 20 years ago, the emerging economies were at most 15 or 20% of the global economy. The bulk of economic activity in the world and the bulk of consumption was in Europe, the United States, and Japan. But that's no longer the case. So now we cannot really afford emerging economies not to play their role in the global economy, which is to grow quickly, right? These are the economies, the up-and-coming economies. They're supposed to grow quickly. They're not growing as quickly as they once did, and that's a problem.
And now you've mentioned the major ones of China, India, Brazil. What about some of the other countries? Are there other Asian countries that were once known as real comers? What's happening with them?
Well, we have, in the emerging world, we have new countries that have now become hot and attractive for investment, and they're growing quickly. I would mention, for example, in Latin America, there's two of them, Colombia and Peru, clearly doing really well, especially compared to 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. If you go to Africa, there's also 2 or 3 economies that are doing better than in the past, even though there are many problems, of course, that continue to limit growth in Africa. In the Middle East, well, we have Turkey, which is doing pretty well. But then right next to it, we have Egypt, which in the wake of the Arab Spring has actually gone through a period of enormous difficulty from an economic and financial point of view for a variety of reasons. And then in Asia, well, we have Pakistan, which is actually doing pretty well. It is growing about at the same pace as India, and this is a very large country as well. And in Southeast Asia, we have now Indonesia doing relatively well, and Malaysia, which seems to have finally recovered from the difficulties from 10 years ago or so. But we still have other economies like Thailand. We have other economies in the region that are not doing as well. And so it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed picture. Some countries are doing better than we were expecting them to do, and others are not performing as well. But on balance, I would say that we're worse off in terms of emerging growth in the emerging economies than we were 2 years ago or 3 years ago.
Now, is there anything that the international community could be doing to make this situation better? Wealthy Western countries or major agencies, the World Bank, organizations like that? Well,
we have way too many question marks in the global economy right now. I mean, just to give you a short list, we have the euro crisis in Europe. It seems as if, now is the month of January, it seems as if over the last couple of months the problem has stabilized a little bit. But that doesn't mean things are going okay in Europe. In fact, we have a recession going on. So there's the double dip recession. The second dip in this recession has been declared as of 6 weeks ago. So we have these very big problems in Europe. And let's not forget that Europe is still 25% of the global market, right? And we have the continuing fiscal crisis in the United States, which is, I think, for the most part, self-inflicted at this point. And we have, of course, Japan, which doesn't seem to be able to find its way out of its own 20-year quasi-recession, right? You know, although the new prime minister seems to be very adamant in that he wants to change things. Let's see what happens. So those are the bigger problems. But if you shift the level of analysis a little bit and you think about the global economic and financial infrastructure, what we have right now is very little collaboration among governments in terms of what should be done. In fact, what we have is governments trying to take advantage of one another. We have all of these currency manipulations going on. China has been for a long time accused of being a currency manipulator, but they're not alone. Over the last year or so, Japan has also tried to reduce the value of the yen so as to remain export competitive. So has Switzerland, right? And so has the United States. In the United States, we have printed a lot of money, and that has put downward pressure on the dollar. And that has made possible a revival of U.S. manufactured exports. So everybody is, trying to look after their own interests. I see very little collaboration among key governments around the world. And I think this is also something that adds to the uncertainty out there.
Now, if there were to be more collaboration, where's the likely country or organization to lead that?
Well, I think there are 3 or 4, maybe 5 countries in the world that really matter right now, that have something to say about a possible way out from this big global slowdown that we happen to be trapped into. Certainly the United States, certainly China. Right? Those are the 2 biggest economies, and they are very important from a financial point of view for very different reasons. Then we have Germany, which in my view should perhaps be the representative from Europe, right? As opposed to having the European Union as such. Germany is the world's 4th largest economy, and it is the 2nd most important export power. And then, of course, you have Japan and possibly the UK, right? But that's about it. I mean, I don't think countries such as Mexico or Brazil or Argentina or Colombia or Indonesia or Turkey should be sitting at the table trying to make decisions, because then the table gets too big. We have too many people negotiating. So what I think we need is 4 or 5 key countries sitting at the table and helping us overcome all of the complexities that we're facing right now in the global economy.
Now, we also hear about fiscal imbalances, and you can explain a little what that means and why that's a problem.
Well, we have all sorts of imbalances in the world. I mean, you mentioned fiscal, which is government spending more money than what they take into us in the form of revenue taxes for the most part. We also have other kinds of imbalances, financial imbalances, we have trade imbalances and so on and so forth. But focusing on the fiscal imbalances, the problem, of course, is that, as you know, investors no longer believe that some governments in the world can, pay them back. And so what we've seen is interest rates on bonds, government bonds, go through the roof for those countries that have lost the trust of investors. Now, at the other side of the equation, we have other countries that can pretty much borrow at 0 interest rates, right? That includes certainly Germany, but also Switzerland, and at least up until now, pretty much also the United States. So these are countries that still are perceived as being solid and being capable of returning the money that they're asking investors to give them. Now, in the U.S., again, I mentioned earlier that most of the fiscal problem is self-inflicted, because the upcoming battle now in the month of February will be the debt ceiling. And of course, this is an artificial thing, right? And I'm sure there's going to be quite a bit of political fighting about it. But the global economy and investors know that the U.S. is at least so far, is a government that can pay its debt, right? Unlike other governments around the world, which cannot right now.
It seems sometimes like the U.S. can get away with murder. I remember, I think it was about 18 months ago when we lost our credit rating, our top rating, and everybody said this will be a catastrophe and interest rates are lower now.
Well, and that was a signal. I think that was a signal to the politicians in Washington, D.C. that they shouldn't do anything crazy, because although the U.S. continues to be the largest economy and it is the most important financial power in the world, its strength is not unlimited, right? But the U.S. has one big advantage, as we all know, which is that the dollar continues to be the most important reserve currency. Like about 70% of all allocated reserves in the world are in dollar-denominated assets. Now, this gives the U.S. quite a bit of leeway, a lot of breathing room with which to play, because once again there is a big appetite for U.S.-denominated dollars, and the U.S. can therefore, play, a different role in the global economy than other economies that don't have that kind of a privilege.
And it looks like investors around the world simply don't believe the U.S. will ever default on its debt. Is that what these numbers tell us?
Well, I would never say that we'll never, ever default, because obviously, what is the time horizon here? Is it 20 years, or is it 50 or 100 or 200 years? If history is of any guide, well, I would definitely bet my pension fund right now in saying that the U.S. Will default within the next 500 years, right? Now, I don't think it will default within the next 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, not in the foreseeable future, right? But a lot of it depends also on what happens to China, and whether China takes more steps in the direction of playing an active role in global finance. And of course, a very important element in all of this will be the yuan. What happens to the Chinese currency? Is the Chinese currency going to become, at some point in the near future, another reserve currency? And then once it becomes a reserve currency, of course, I think the prediction is that it will probably become an important reserve currency. I don't think it will displace the dollar, but it will become an important reserve currency, maybe at the same level as the euro, 15, 20% of all currency reserves in the world. But we're still at least 5, 7, 10 years away from that. In the meantime, the U.S. continues to, be the most important economy in the world from the financial point of view, and will continue to be, or to have, the most important reserve currency.
So let's just finish with a sort of a projection for 2013. Do you think that at the end of this year, conditions will look much different from the way they are now, either better or worse?
Well, 12 months down the road, I think if we go region by region, I think things will look much, much better here in the United States, unless, of course, something really weird happens in Washington, D.C. over the next 2 or 3 months regarding all of these fiscal negotiations. Europe, I think, is not going to be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel yet, at the end of this year, 2013. Why? Well, because they seem set on a an array of austerity measures, and these austerity measures may at some point be effective, but it's not going to be anytime soon. If that's the way they want to overcome their problems, it's going to take a while, right? And of course, unemployment in the meantime will be very, very high. And then I think the big question mark is where we started this conversation. It's with the emerging economies. Will the two that worry me the most, India and Brazil, because of their size and because of some of the problems that they're encountering, will they manage to reverse the decline in their growth rates? I think this is a very urgent question, especially in the case of Brazil. So I think emerging economies, hopefully, more likely than not, they will be better off at the end of this year, but certainly not Europe, and hopefully the U.S. will be better off, yeah.
Well, we'll come back in a year and see how it turned out. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.